a little bit of what I'm drinking, and man, oh man, like there was this discourse about Lefroy online yesterday. There was like everyone apparently either really hates it or like really loves it, and people who love it are like, that's you're a Scotch connoisseur, like you know what you're doing, and so I'm so excited.
I turned my fan off instead of on. Hold on, let me put this back.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that seems to be, that's true. Like Lefroy is kind of like the snobby line, right? When it comes to Scotch, is like, if you really like peaty Scotches, you really like Lefroy, or you don't like Scotch, right?
Exactly.
So that's kind of the
yeah. I've been trying to become like less snobby, but COVID isn't helping because I'm only talking to myself when I drink. So like I'm just like, okay.
Yeah. There's nobody there to judge you, so I mean, it's not good. I mean, like even my wife and I, who like to make cocktails and stuff like that. Like, I mean, we're like enabling each other, so it's really not helpful. So though with the students now, so Peter, you were saying earlier you're just about to kind of be done with the semester. Our semester ended last week, so the students are slowly kind of filtering away, and so there's high rates of vaccination in our area, actually, and so it's starting to open up a lot. So I'm a little bit nervous about going out and then being judged on all the things I've been doing at home for the last year and a half, and not knowing how to interact with other human beings.
I will say, when it comes to being judged, so like I've been teaching online, right? And so this past semester when I was teaching, it turned out at like the end of like every other class or so, like a few of the dudes who were in my class would be like, is that like a hibiki behind you? Is that Lagavulin behind you? And so after the semester ended, like grades are submitted, I got 3 different emails from these different students who were like, okay, now that the semester's over, I have to recommend this bottle. Or now that the semester's over, where did you get this bottle? And I'm like, oh my God.
There's really, I mean, there is something nice about the experience in that, like the students get to see us as kind of more authentic selves, like wherever we teach. Like, I mean, sometimes like I went into my office because there was nobody in the building and did that, but sometimes I would be at home, and then like exactly that. They'd ask like, oh, did I see that book like on your bookshelf behind you? And then you could have a conversation about that. So it was really kind of nice in that way. Yeah. So anyway, should we get going?
Yeah.
Sorry.
We should get going.
Yeah.
Okay, so today we have Dr. Peter Shulman. He works on history of technology, science, and American politics in the 19th and 20th centuries. He's a professor at Case Western Reserve. He also is the director of undergraduate studies there. And so his book is Coal and Empire. But he's also, it was published in 2015. He's also working on a couple of other really cool projects, mainly a history of intelligence. Specifically intelligence in American history. So I'm excited to talk about that. And I think we'll get started off with the first question. Peter, what are you drinking?
So, hi Matt, hi Varsha. Hi. It's a hot day here in Cleveland, and I made a caipirinha. So I'm happy with my caipirinha. I went and got some cachaça for it. And I decided to try it with some jaggery instead of regular sugar because I had some. So it's kind of a little more rustic caipirinha, and it's pretty tasty. This is a drink I learned how to make in college from a professor. It was a dear mentor of mine. And we got together once and he said, let me teach you how to make a caipirinha, and you can make all the drinks for our little gathering. I said, okay. And making them ever since.
Nice. Matt, how about you?
I have a cocktail as well. It's quite hot here in Virginia as well, so I thought that this would be nice. This is called an Americano. It has some sweet vermouth and some Campari in equal parts, and then a little bit of seltzer water just kind of mixed in, and then it's served over ice with a little bit of a orange garnish in there as well. As somebody said on Twitter, it's like I can have more than one of these version of the Negroni. And it's really lovely on a hot day. And in fact, it will always have a special place in my heart just to before just to share a little story, is before the pandemic happened, my wife and I went on our 20-year wedding anniversary. We were in Bologna and Italy, and I learned about this drink because I wanted something, because it was like 100 degrees there. And I had one of these on a piazza overlooking Santo Stefano, which is an old 10th and 11th century church. And that will stay with me forever. And so it's probably partially that why I love it so much, but it is also delicious. So Rachel, what about you? What are you drinking today?
I am drinking a gin and tonic. Very simple. It's very hot, but I love gin is my favorite. So
yeah, it's hot here too, but I couldn't give away the chance of like drinking something. It's not, somebody told me online that it's technically cold themed. It's not cold themed, but it's Lefroy Quarter Cask. It's peatier than the 10-year-old. It's one of my favorite scotches. Lefroy was the first scotch that I ever tried. I tried it on a date, and the person on the date, the dude, when he poured himself a glass, he like added, ice to it and like water to it. And this is, after I'd already experienced, drinking bourbon properly. Like I knew not to add ice to it. At least now I've changed. But like back then I didn't add ice to anything. And I just drank it neat. And he was like, whoa, that's impressive. And yeah, I mean, it only went to a first date, but yeah, it's a good scotch.
I gotta say, Varsha, like adding ice to bourbon is gonna be the Yoko Ono of drinking with historians. Like that's the thing that's gonna pull us apart. Like finally is.
I do it sometimes, but the thing is, anyone who adds ice to scotch, like, why do you do that to yourself? Why are you destroying something so pure and beautiful by adding ice to scotch? Like, I understand maybe adding a few drops of water to your scotch, but yeah.
So my grandfather, my late grandfather, for 50 years, his hobby was winemaking. And he was from Ohio, but lived in Baltimore for most of his life, and started in the early 50s getting grapes in from the Napa Valley, shipped in, and he turned his basement into a wine cellar, big barrels and all the equipment, and did it for 50 years and got really, really good at it. And the amazing thing was he traveled all over the world to wineries, vineyards, everywhere. He submitted to all these state fairs, won a ton of awards, and had basically every wine there was to have. And he knew everybody in the field. He was a member of the wine society. And his thing was, if it tastes good to you, it's good wine. He didn't care. He didn't care what you like. It could be cheap and delicious, fine. If you like it, it's good. He was the least pretentious person. And I think that's the way to live. If you like ice in your bourbon, then that's, at least you're drinking good bourbon.
That's right. Thank you, Peter. I'm right. Varsha's wrong. So there we go.
Okay. We can accept that Peter is right on that, but let's begin with
everything really else he's wrong about.
Yeah, let's begin with a really important question.
Right. All right. Thank you. First of all, can we say let's say thank you to Rachel so she can disappear into the background. And just a reminder again, like when you have questions, put them in the Q&A. We'll be sure to get to them in the second half hour. Rachel will be there checking them and sending them on to us so we can ask them of Peter. So thank you, Rachel.
Yeah. So first question that will, set Peter on the path to being wrong. Peter, your book is called Coal and Empire. Did you set out to cancel coal? Was that your initial goal in grad school?
Okay. Let me tell you what I did set out to do, because I came to this project very much by accident. Like I think a lot of dissertations. This book started as a dissertation, like a lot of first books do. And I went to grad school. I started in the fall of 2001, and I knew that I wanted to do something about the history of energy. And this was a time where there were very few historians who were writing about the history of energy. The historiography was pretty small. It's a pretty tight group of actually, tight as everybody knew each other, but it was pretty disparate. People came at it from different perspectives. I had done some work for a summer in college at a think tank doing energy policy, which got me thinking about it in the first place. And I took this seminar with a professor who said, I started studying energy in the 70s because of the oil crisis, and I thought it'd be just something to work on for a while. And it turns out it never went out of fashion because it's always an issue. Energy is always an issue. I'm like, all right. But I thought I would write about oil. That was what I expected, because oil is the obvious kind of big, monster in terms of our energy addiction right now. And I wanted to kind of combine my interest in kind of the foreign policy side of it with kind of geopolitics with the environmental history, which I was also really, really interested in. And so that was the main idea for the project, bring those together. And I was doing this kind of reading group with one of my mentors in grad school and a couple of other grad students about US foreign relations history. And we were reading something that mentioned coaling stations. And someone's like, what's a coaling station? Peter does energy. What's a coaling station? I'm like, oh, it's like a gas station for ships in the like late 19th, early 20th century. Well, tell us more about coaling stations. Like, all right, well, I'm going to the archives literally next week to DC. Let me just kind of find more about coaling stations just to see what's there. And so I started looking and like, all right, so this will be like a subsection of that intro chapter where I kind of start with the coaling station. And it grew into a chapter. And then I'm like, I think this is going to be the whole project. And I got dragged deeper and deeper into the 19th century because I wanted to kind of explain the start of where I wanted to get to, but the start kept getting further and further back. And next thing you know, I'm in the 1840s and they're talking about coal and foreign relations. And I'm like, why are they talking about coal and foreign relations in the 1840s, right? Oil is the foreign relations energy, not coal. Britain had coal, and that was a big thing in the night. But what is the U.S. doing? I guess I should probably write about that. And that was what kind of launched the dissertation. And whether I wanted to cancel coal, I mean, coal's not a great thing for the world. I'll put it that way. It's not great.
Yeah. Well, from the down here in Appalachia, from my house, if I crane my neck, I can see the on-campus coal plant that still powers most of Virginia Tech. And there's been a movement, of course, for students and faculty to divest and to find other natural things. But it seems kind of, one of the things you kind of hear about coal, especially now, is that it's kind of ingrained into the culture. It's not just simply like a mode of energy production, right? It is kind of a cultural production. We were joking earlier about, you see a lot down here, like Friends of Coal bumper stickers that are there. So like, has that always been the case, or is that something kind of relatively new in the way that Americans have thought about coal?
So I guess I answer that by kind of saying at different times, coal has mattered in different ways, and it's been seen culturally in different ways. What we're seeing today, right? Right now, there are, I don't know, fewer than 50,000 coal miners, not just miners, like people in the coal industry, like across the country.
There are more graduate students than coal miners. I read that statistic a couple years ago.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, there are more undergrads at, I don't know, probably Ohio State than there are, coal miners or something. Like it's a very, very tiny industry in terms of employment right now. A century ago, it was a major source of employment because the labor involved was so immense. And particularly in the places like, where Matt is, kind of on the border between Virginia and West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, or at the times Illinois, or different parts of the country at different times, coal has mattered quite a great deal for jobs. So today it's just very much kind of a cultural touchstone, part of our culture wars. It's not really a significant source of employment. It's not a significant driver of the economy. It's relatively easy to convert existing coal plants to gas plants, which I'm sure, Matt, yours will at some point. When it's time to retrofit it, it's going to become a gas plant, if not something else. We had one that, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago on campus became a gas plant instead. I remember I used to see the big truck pull up and dump all the coal in every morning, and it doesn't do that anymore. So it's going to phase out, at least domestically. Whether we keep exporting it for countries that are going to still burn it, I mean, we shouldn't, but that may still happen for a little bit longer. With industrialization, with kind of the mechanization of production, it's required far fewer people, and with the availability of other fuels, it's declined in its economic significance. And if you go back to the 19th century, I mean, the associations culturally with coal it was progress, right? It was modernity. It was be able to provide, whether it's steam power or from steam to electricity, right? This was modernity. Actually, I think I went to Virginia Tech to do some archival research many years ago, but I think what I'm thinking of came from University of Michigan and their archives. But I found all these wonderful early mid 20th century coal industry, like watercolors, about like just the wonders of coal, and they're beautiful and evocative. And I could dig them up there on my computer somewhere. But like these images of like, warmly shoveling the coal into the hearth to keep your family warm, and like beautiful railroads, symbols of progress. So kind of coal had this this aura of progress to it. But one of the things I found really cool about looking at the 19th century was there were so many energy transitions that happened really quickly with new sources of power, from kind of muscle and some kinds of wind in certain contexts and animal power to first coal for steam, and then electricity, and then gas becomes a source of energy, and then petroleum. That there's this idea that, okay, there's always going to be something new. And the idea that coal would still be around a century or more, a century and a half later, might have seemed actually kind of weird to 19th century Americans, because there was always something new. The engineers are always coming up with something innovative, and maybe something's going to replace coal, just like coal replaced the horse. But then it kind of gets stuck, and I think especially as we stopped consuming it directly in our furnaces, and we stopped dealing with the smoke directly, and it became, the power plants are outside city limits and we don't typically need to encounter them. It became easy to kind of forget that we were still using it in this very kind of old-fashioned old chunk of rock.
So building on that, so we sort of know what coal, why coal was important, or the importance coal had in the United States, domestically. Where does foreign relations fit into this?
So
how did you get into that?
Yeah, so for me, the kind of pivot of the book was going back to understanding the coaling stations. And over the past many decades, there's been a kind of big literature about where did the American empire come from? And this is usually the overseas empire. And, I was trying to kind of figure out, right, how do we acknowledge the continuities with continental imperialism, which is should be completely obvious. And certainly historians have made that connection over many decades, but it still seems like, both in the literature, but also in our kind of general perception, it's something different in some way. This is new territory that was going to become a state at some point. When you go overseas, when the U.S. goes overseas, right, it's not clear that any of these territories are going to become states, and most of them don't. Hawaii is the one exception. Alaska is kind of a weird case, but the Philippines and Guantanamo Bay and Puerto Rico and Samoa and Guam, right? They don't become states, right? And it was pretty clear they probably weren't going to become states, at least at the time. So I was trying to figure out that, how do we kind of balance those continuities with the discontinuities? And in the kind of laundry list of explanations for why did the overseas empire happen? Right, the Navy needed coaling stations. Okay, so this is something to understand. If I'm going to be the expert on coaling stations, I want to understand, is that correct? Is that the reason? Was the Navy indeed searching for coaling stations? And, I looked at the documents, and it didn't really look like it. It didn't really seem like that's the case. What turns out is the US gets an empire and then says, we need coaling stations to support the empire. It's reversed, right? Causality backwards in the usual accounts. And it's once the U.S. signs that treaty with Spain to acquire the Philippines, right? How do we protect it? It's totally vulnerable, right? How do we get our ships there? How do we restock them? We got to build forts, and we got to build facilities in Hawaii and in the Philippines and in Guam, and we got to kind of have this infrastructure to support modern industrial warfare. And we've got this Panama Canal. We're going to build this canal within a couple of years. Got to fortify it to make sure that the infrastructure is workable around the globe. But if you go back even in the 1890s, the discussions, it was revelatory to me to kind of see, to go back and read Alfred Thayer Mahan, who's everybody cites Mahan. Everybody talks about Mahan, but if you read what Mahan's actually writing in the 1890s, he wasn't giving a blueprint for how the U.S. should become a global power. He was saying, here are all the reasons why the U.S. isn't going to become a global power. Because we're not going to build this giant navy like the British. That's on them. We're not going. What we need to do is to have, battleships to hang close to the coasts to protect the coasts, and fast cruisers to be able to sail all around the globe with lots of coal, so you don't have to stop at coaling. We don't need coaling stations if we have ships big enough to carry a lot of coal, right? it was short-circuiting the whole notion that there needed to be coaling stations, and the cruisers were only meant to protect commerce anyway. They weren't meant to wage offensive war. They were kind of defensive outposts, floating outposts. That was what Mahan was saying. Then the U.S. goes ahead and gets an empire, and then the Navy has to kind of backfill. We need coaling stations to support this empire, and they start kind of building up all this new infrastructure. Why I go back to the 1840s though is this moment. There's a ship in Boston Harbor. I lived in Boston, in and around Boston for 10 years. The USS Constitution, which is the oldest naval vessel still in service in the world. It's been in service since the 1790s. I want to say 1797. I forget exactly the year, sometime around then.
Wait, the same ship?
Well, that's a good question. It is the same ship, but all the pieces have been replaced at one point. But it's been a kind of continuously in use. Yeah. As like parts are swapped in and out. Is it the same ship? I don't know. I think that's one kind of old Greek paradox in logic. So, but yeah, the ship is still. You could join the Navy and become, stationed on the USS Constitution. And anyway, the Constitution was sent on one single round-the-world cruise in the mid-1840s, and the secret mission. And this is cool. Like in the archives, like this is the secret part. We're not going to publish the secret instructions to the captain. The secret instructions were go to Borneo because there's this in the little Sultanate of Brunei, we just discovered coal on this little island offshore called Labuan, and get the coal before the British do, and we'll be able to get coal over in Southeast Asia, which we want to have because we're going to build these steamships to go from wherever, West Coast eventually. They're not quite there yet, but East Coast get to Southeast Asia for trade purposes. That was what they really wanted to do. Build up a trade infrastructure. So the ship goes there, and it's a complete comedy of errors and a disaster. They don't actually end up getting. They only end up getting the coal, but a couple years later, when much more famously, soon to be Commodore Perry goes to Japan. For those who are specialists in the literature, they would know that there were a lot of excuses justifying that mission, but the biggest reason that they didn't want to talk about was Japan wasn't the goal. The goal was China. The market was China. Japan was in the way to get to China, and you needed to have places to stop for the steamships that they hadn't built yet, but wanted to build to go stop and safely refuel. So again, it's about getting coal in this mission. And it was really cool to see. There are 3 volumes of Perry's kind of the official accounts of the voyage, which was over a couple of years. And the first volume is the narrative, and that's the one that historians have, for obvious reasons, worked with the most. Kind of a day-by-day, account of what happened on the ship. There's wonderful etchings in it, illustrations, super cool, and very weirdly published by both the House and the Senate, which I've never seen. Maybe a few exceptions. There are very few documents that the House and the Senate both published, but they both published versions of this. I don't know why. Never figured that out. Anyway, the first volume is the narrative, and then the second volume is all this natural history, exploration, chapter after chapter. Some are about like exploring for coal in different places, and some are about animals they found. And it's stuff we associate with kind of 19th century British expeditions, but there were some examples of it happening in the U.S. as well. And then the third volume is all these astronomical observations. And as a historian of science and technology, I was really interested in those second 2 volumes as much as the first one. And so that it's clear that Americans are thinking about being in the world in the mid-19th century and starting to associate that with new needs of industrialized infrastructure. And that was what I really wanted to kind of tease apart.
It's really interesting the way that you're describing it, because it's flipping this narrative in which empire pulls the need for coal along with it, but at the same time, like that story about the Constitution kind of flips it on the other way again, right? In that the need for coal drives further expansion of naval power and stuff like that, especially into Southeast Asia. So they seem. Sorry, go ahead.
There are like I had to try to be very careful. Like, what were the motives, right? What were commercial motives? What were kind of naval military motives? And obviously that one can feed into the other very easily, and sometimes they can both be operative at the same time. But sometimes they were genuinely distinct, and I think the consequences of those, if they're distinct, can end up being really different. So sorry, I cut you off.
No. That's exactly what I was trying to get at, is just about like how do you discern those types of motives, right? And you said that, and you know, it's interesting too. You framed yourself at the very end about Commodore Perry's or Perry's, before he was Commodore, his account, the different volumes in which it really is an awareness of the world in a way that seems something kind of different than we might expect, right? It's not a military expedition. It's a scientific, it's a, you know, an astronomical, it's a navigational expedition as much as it is anything else. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot about if you read a lot of different documents from the Spanish explorers when they're exploring South America and North America during the early days of colonization. That's a lot what it sounds like. And so, you know, you mentioned like this interest in like the environment and natural environment, and you know what's going on in these places when they're looking for coal. How does environmental history or environmentalism sort of play into it? Does that sort of, you know, challenge coal, people who are pro coal in the early 20th century, or does that only come by in like the 1970s?
No, it's definitely earlier, although mainly in the context of urban pollution, right? That's the most obvious place that you see it in late 19th, early 20th century cities: Pittsburgh, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland. They have such urban air pollution that, you know, different organizations of different cities kind of get together to fight the pollution menace, and so it's one of the many spurs for the electrification or switch to kind of diesel electric locomotion, because it's much cleaner, much less obvious. You can burn the electricity, you know, burn the coal for electricity much further away than, you know, in tunnels in cities or like right in urban downtowns. Yeah. So that's where it comes up most obviously, you know, prior to the later part of the 20th century. But you know, I have a friend at Penn State, Brian Black, a wonderful historian, and his first book actually was about this was about oil, but kind of the environmental consequences of the first oil boom in Pennsylvania in the 1850s and 60s, and there were tremendous ecological consequences, at least localized, of just, you know, oil spilling everywhere into the rivers, into the streams, into the woods, and it was certainly noticed. It was certainly a consequence. You know, the boosters would defend it as this is progress. You know, dirty air means the economy is going great, right? This is a great thing. I have a quote from this journalist from the 19th century talking about Pittsburgh, and, you know, this is how we know that our city's on the up and up. I mean, it's kind of, by making that argument, kind of conceding that some people thought it was a problem. But yeah, the context, it certainly changes after World War II with greater affluence and other available sources of power. I think that ends up making a difference. There was, in the late 19th century, I'm trying to remember what city this was. I can't remember. It may have been Pittsburgh. But there was a short-lived boom in natural gas, and gas for a couple of years supplanted coal, and the air got really cleaner, and then the local gas ran out and went back to coal, and everyone's like, wait a minute, it doesn't have to be this way. This is bad again. We want the gas. And so I can't remember where that was. I read this years ago. I'll have to dig that up somewhere.
Yeah. Can I ask a kind of a naive question? Like, again, as the old-timey historian, like way back in the Middle Ages, but somebody who works on kind of ideas of empire too. This got me thinking about the question, Varsha, you asked about kind of environmental history, and I'm curious about, like, has there been a lot of stuff? And I guess this is partially for Peter and partially for Varsha, about environmental history and ideas of empire, because I'm thinking about kind of medieval ideas of empire. Certainly the Carolingians, and then the Holy Roman Empire to a degree, is that there's a lot of treatises that are written at that time about things that we would consider kind of scientific knowledge, and specifically for the idea that the empire is a master of beasts and nature in some fundamental way. And then I have a colleague here at Virginia Tech who just came out with a really great book about the Spanish mendicants and all the treatises on the natural world that they wrote as a way of kind of again, kind of conquering nature and bringing that into kind of the Spanish Empire. So, like, is that like a thing? Is that a thread that you guys see in this work?
Like mastering nature to master empire?
Yeah, like well, just this quick elision, this kind of explicit elision within kind of environmental history about this idea of empire as a thread within environmental history.
Yeah, I mean, there's much more work, I think, in like 18th, 19th century British environmental history than because I mean the British Empire is so dominant, you know, globally at that certainly by the 19th century. But yeah, I think there's a pretty wide literature within environmental history now on that. There's plenty, and Varsha, you're probably familiar with, you know, there's good works about kind of post World War II U.S. becoming a global kind of the environmental consequences of American global, you know, superiority or whatever, superpower status or something like that. Yeah.
I totally agree. I think one thing that most of the literature focuses on US after World War II and like other places that are not continental US, but the work that I did a while ago about Native Americans and like water rights in the United States and the American West, America's continental empire is secured by mastering the environment or mastering the rivers in the American West. Yeah. Right. And that argument has been made by like, you know, a bunch of historians before me, Worster, you know, Reisner. But if you look specifically at the relationship between like the federal government and like Native Americans and like the legal relationship that they sort of have, that's where like the environmental control and like the environmental, you know, mastery over rivers plays like a big role. But Peter is definitely right that when you look at empire or maybe like decolonization and how decolonizing countries sort of view the United States and environmental history and environmentalism, that also plays a big role. So like after the 1970s, there's like a big environmental movement in the US, but there's also environmental movement in India, which is like where I work on, right? And so India starts to like, you know, grapple with ideas of environmentalism and ideas about the environment that they've like gleaned from the US, but also from Britain. And so there's like this conflict between, you know, are we going to Western? Are we, you know, should we be modernizing like this, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, I think that's why, you know, when I read Coal and Empire for comps, that's sort of what got into my head about it.
I'd be honored if you spent an hour on it. I remember how comps
I spent at least 4 hours on it. It was
exceeding expectations 4 times over.
Yes.
Can I throw out another name? I mentioned Brian Black at Penn State about his first book is called Petrolia, which is the name of the town. But Richard Tucker, do you know Richard Tucker's book Insatiable Appetite about the U.S. and the degradation of the tropical world? Because that covers also it's a lot. I'm pretty sure it's all pre-World War II, although it's been a while since I've looked at it. I think like late 19th, early 20th century. But looking at kind of U.S. foreign relations around the world, economic relations around the world, you know, particularly looking for raw materials of various kinds, tropical products and things like that, that had tremendous ecological consequences. And that's a really good place that makes the kind of empire story pretty explicit. There are plenty of other books on bananas and
sure,
and things like that too.
Yeah. Okay. It is the second half hour, and we do have some kind of questions. And just a reminder, like, please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll kind of move on from them. The first question we have is from Helen, who asks if you could talk a little bit more about this push for clean air. Like you mentioned this kind of in one specific city. I think you mentioned it might have been Pittsburgh, with this transition to natural gas and then the transition back to coal. Like, where was that push initially located? Like, was it kind of wealthy elites? Was it kind of a widespread sentiment, or was it something more local, or, you know, kind of what was going on with that?
Yeah, I mean, the push for clean air is definitely a 19th century industrialization story, and we kind of see it play out in a couple of different ways, right? Part of it is suburbanization, right? 19th century suburbanization was often a response by people who could afford to do so to move to cleaner, nicer places while keeping the jobs and the economic activity, that whatever, you know, money that they're making in the city, but getting to a healthier place. Right? So I live in Cleveland, in Shaker Heights. We used to live in Cleveland Heights, right? These were literally higher than the kind of the basin of where the city is along Lake Erie. And these are among the earliest suburbs. You know, once, you know, Clevelanders got out of the city limits itself, they moved to higher elevations because the air was cleaner, among other reasons. So for people who could afford to do so would simply move out. in the 19th century, kind of before there were specific laws about pollution, uh, it ended up being kind of individual cases of nuisance, like so many other environmental issues, right? They had to be kind of a lawsuit on the grounds of, my property is being damaged in some way by someone else's negligence in emitting, all this smoke that they shouldn't have to be emitting or something like that. So that's kind of how it started. And in plenty of cities, again, Pittsburgh, New York, others, there were these organizations that developed, kind of pushed the whether it's the city government or state governments to crack down on air fouling and things like that. And some of them ended up being successful.
There's a really good question from Jonathan. His question, I know your book isn't about, the U.S. labor movement, but he asked, what is the role of coal in with the U.S. labor movement, specifically, how does coal sort of play between management and labor? Does it have a role in, does labor have a role in how you think about U.S. foreign policy and coal?
That's a great question. It's been a couple of years since I taught my, what did I call it? Energy in American History. I think that was what it was. Energy in American History course. Energy and Environment in American History. I forget. Again, it's been a couple of years. Anyway, telling all of American history from the perspective of energy. And one of the ways that I actually organized it was chronological, but each week we would take a different kind of subdisciplinary approach, right? So some weeks we were looking at the history of science, of thermodynamics, and the development of steam engines and in the 19th century. And another week we would look at oil and foreign relations. And when we did coal, we did both the building of networks and infrastructure, history, technology, but also labor, because there's a huge labor story in the 19th and early 20th century, and continues. But that's what I kind of focused on for that class. Yeah, I mean, the United Mine Workers was founded in 1890, I think, and was among the kind of epicenters for the development of a modern labor movement. And it was a deeply bloody conflict over several decades. And
all out war in places like Philly and places like that. Yeah.
In Colorado, in West Virginia. Yeah, for sure. It was really, people literally got killed. I mean, it was often quite violent. Actually, when I was out in Virginia Tech, I rented a car, again, this is years ago, and I drove to the Pocahontas coal mine, which was just over the border. I'm pretty sure it was on the West Virginia side, I think. I can't remember which side of the border it was, right on, I think, the West Virginia side. And this mine had been a mine that produced coal for the Navy back in the 19th century, because it was a particular kind of semi-bituminous coal, which is kind of halfway between regular bituminous and anthracite coal. And it didn't emit much smoke. So the Navy liked it because it was less obvious if they were steaming around, the enemy wouldn't see them. So it was a really cool kind of coal for them. And so it was cool. I got to visit the mine. I took a tour, walked the ground, and you can kind of see there's a huge labor story here too. You can see the old signage about injuries and how frequent they were in the U.S. And as I can tell you, more frequent in the U.S. than in other coal producing countries, like particularly in Western Europe at the exact same time, because of an imperative lack of laws, lack of enforcement, and lack of unionization, and imperatives of capitalism. A lot of corners get cut, and so do people. So yeah, so there is a huge labor story here. We could look at it in terms of kind of the growth of the labor movement as an organized movement. You can look at it in terms of the fundamental nature of energy production to the economy. So whether it's the great anthracite strike of 1902, it's been a while since I've looked at it. I think it was 1902, 1, 2, or 3, but I think 2. Big anthracite strike in Pennsylvania, which really caused a lot of industries to seize up, because anthracite was only coming from this one little spot in eastern Pennsylvania. And you can kind of look at it again, kind of the role of coal in World War I was super important. And at the time, actually wasn't a lack of coal itself, but the railroad infrastructure was so disorganized that the coal couldn't get from where it was to where it needed to be consumed. And it basically caused the government to nationalize the railroad industry, which is kind of crazy. I mean, if you think about the American context, World War One is way weirder than World War Two. Let me just say,
So weird.
So
So
much
weird.
weirder. And like, because World War II, because it was such a framing for everything that came after, it feels like normal. This is of course why the origins of things that are around it. World War One, they did what?
There's like, they just nationalized so many things, and they're spying on people. Oh, the U.S. government sort of lost it during World War
There are people like, let's change the entire story. Let's have new departments of science and technology. Like, okay, like that's wild.
Go for it, man. It was wild.
Weird time. So yeah, so labor's a huge strike because there were over time, millions of workers in this industry. Right now, today it's under 45,000, 50,000, millions. What they did could really, shape the lives of everybody else, which is why these battles over unionization were so pitched. And so, yeah, so you can tell so much of American history just from the perspective of the coal fields.
So I was wondering if I could. This isn't an audience question, but I'm going to take host privilege, and because I want to see if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about your new project, okay. Specifically about the history of intelligence. Could you just kind of talk a little bit about kind of what you're thinking this is going to be, sure. what the parameters are and stuff?
Well, let me tell you, that's one of two big projects and one little project I'm working on. I want to get them all on the table. So the intelligence book was going to be book 2. I have moved it to book 3. I'm still working on it. But
you have 2 in planning? Impressive.
I had 2. Okay, so just, I don't know, Varsha, what your experience is. I had things I discovered in grad school that I said, hey, someday I should write an article about that. And I, file away some archival documents, file some stuff away. When I finished the book, I'm like, okay, now I got some time. But then once your book comes out, you get it, like, you want to write a chapter in this book? You want to write a chapter in that book? I'm like, sure, that would be really nice. Thanks for thinking of me. I feel these things are now on my plate. And okay, so I get to, all right, before I get to the intelligence book, which I'm super excited about, I have these 2 things left. One article about, it's kind of a late 20th century follow-up to the work I did in the book. At the end of the book, I talk about the Teapot Dome affair, segueing from coal to oil. And in like 30 seconds, right? These were oil fields set aside by the government in the early 20th century to be emergency sources of oil for the Navy initially, as the Navy shifted over to oil, because if they were to run out, it would be a national security crisis. So just save these, don't give these fields away, save them for emergencies. Well, in 1998, skipping ahead, the big field, Elk Hills, in fact, Teapot Dome turned out not to have very much oil, even though that's the one everyone knows of. Elk Hills in California was the one that had a lot of oil. It had been opened up for production briefly in around 1944 for World War II, and then shut in after the war. And it was going to be this emergency supply. 1998, the field gets sold, biggest single divestiture, $3.6 billion oil sale in 1998 under the Clinton administration. And I'm like, why did they sell it? This went from being like the most valuable property that the government owned to something to be sold off. So I'm like, I'll write an article about this. And I had a pretty good sense of what I figured out the story. I don't know if you remember, I wrote a little thing in the Post a little while ago about the Defense Production Act in the context of COVID. The reason why I knew anything about the Defense Production Act is it plays a role in this history as to why the government divested this field. So I'm like, let me write this up. But before I do, I'm going to send a Freedom of Information Act request to the Department of Energy to get the documents because it's not yet in the archives. Cool. Send off the request. A week or 2 later, I get an email. It says, okay, here are the 60 cubic feet of documents. It's in storage. And it's going to go to, this is like, let's say, this is in 2014, I think, summer of 2014. And it's going to go to the National Archives in 2020. Fine. That's a long time away, 2020. That's the future. That's like science fiction. let me do this FOIA request. When can I come see the documents? Haha, dummy. You can't come see the documents. You have to like send us a request and tell us what you're looking for. Okay, this is what I'm looking for. Okay, how about you look somewhere else? Okay, what's somewhere else? There's nothing there. You should look over here. Okay, there's nothing there. What about that? No, nothing there. Why don't you show me the documents that are actually the things that are responsive to what I'm looking for? Fine. It may take a little while, but we'll get it to you soon. Okay. It's been 7 years. my documents. So this article is not done. And I tell you, every couple of weeks, I get an email from them saying, you still want the documents? Yes, I still want the documents. And so this is an ongoing, I will let you know if I ever get the documents. This is an article, that's a little article, like it's mostly written, but I want these documents to finish it up, and I'm not finishing the little document. Okay, that's the little project. Then the thing there was another little project that grew into a bigger project was while I was working in the archives on the Cole book back when I was in grad school, I found, so again, I'm looking for anything that has to do with like the traditional things, like the military and politics and government and foreign relations and like environmental history and science and technology. And I found there were these lands set aside in the US South, first in Georgia, South Carolina, then really big in Florida, Louisiana, of trees that were really valuable for naval shipbuilding purposes in the late 18th and early 19th century. They're called live oak trees. They're still around, and they grow in these really weird curvy shapes. And they're really dense, and they're really resistant to rot. And a trained shipbuilder would go, leave the fields in the Northeast, go down to the South, find these trees and say, that's a futon, right? That's going to be part of this hull. That's going to be a spar. And they would carve them up right there and ship them back for the shipbuilder. There was a big concern that all these settlers were chopping them all down to make farms, and there weren't going to be these trees, and there wasn't going to be a navy because all the ships were made out of this really valuable wood. And worse yet, we think that people are just chopping them down and selling them to France. France! This is terrible. So they started reserving these trees. And I find there's a cool story. There's been a little bit written about it. Like there's more to be said. There are all these documents no one's ever looked at that I found in the archives. I'm going to write about this. Fine. This was going to be an article. I've been meaning to finish it for years. I finally sat down to finish it. And I'm like, before I do, and I have these plenty of great archival documents, great pictures. This is going to be great. Simple, straightforward story. It ends at the Civil War. Nice and neat. Let me just go through the US serial set. Varsha, have you spent much time in the US serial set? Okay, I love the serial set. This was something.
It's my favorite thing, but it's very messy.
It's great. Back when I was in grad school, it was still on microfiche. Now it's all digitized, super cool. And these are, for those of you who haven't used this, these are like the official publications of the House or Senate, right? I mentioned the Perry journals before. That's part of the serial set. There's a parallel congressional hearing testimony set as well. And so these are, reports from committees, investigations, reports on legislation, all sorts of stuff, and everything's in there. There's just tons and tons of stuff. And I'd seen a lot of these for this project, and I had a lot of them, but I'm like, let me just go through one more time. Maybe there's some little stuff that I missed. So I'm going through, literally, it started in like 1790, year by year, and I flagged the ones that might have some interesting details. I found the cool thing that like in the 1830s, naval uniforms had the live oak, the clusters of oaks from like the oak acorns from the live oaks were on the uniforms because the live oaks were so important. I'm like, that's a cool detail. I'm going to put that in a sentence somewhere in this article. And then I get to 1850 and 1851, 52, and all of a sudden, my search for live oak is turning up documents about Michigan. Now, there are no live oak trees in Michigan. Why are they there? And in Minnesota and in Wisconsin. And I'm very confused. And so I start to look into it, and I discover there was a Supreme Court case in 1850. A few years before that, there was this guy who went to Michigan, to federal lands in Michigan, these big woods in Michigan, and he was chopping down trees. They were not his trees. They were the property of the people of the United States. They had just been taken from Native Americans, but now they were the property of the United States. He was chopping them down, and the local was called it then the district attorney, which is now what we consider like the U.S. attorney, like the federal lawyer there, wanted to charge him with a crime. But it wasn't a crime to chop down trees in Michigan, but it was a crime back to 1831, a crime to chop down live oak trees in the South that were set aside for naval shipbuilding purposes. So he charges them under that law. And it goes to, first it's in the circuit court, and they split. It goes to the Supreme Court, and they're like, work some stuff out. It goes back to the circuit, goes back to the Supreme Court. And eventually they say, unanimous opinion by the Supreme Court. Well, the title of that act says, and for other purposes, right? Live oak and other trees. So we're going to interpret that as meaning it covers everything. Every tree on every public land in the United States. So it went from like a couple of dozens of thousands of acres in the South to like 2 billion acres across the continent. And
You thought
then,
you had a small story, and it
I
grew.
know. Yeah. And then,
Oh,
but then
the worst.
the government's like, we have to enforce this now. So they make a timber police. And they
Oh
said,
my God.
they have a timber police in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And I'm like, okay, I wonder if there are documents about the timber police in the National Archives. Well, there are. I tell you, Matt and Varsha, there are documents about the timber police. So I got the timber police, and then the General Land Office is kind of running this program, and it goes on for decades. And I'm like, I guess I gotta tell this story. So, but the cool thing was, here's the cool thing. When it was just an article that I was going to finish, and it should have been published by now, before I got distracted, I had a clear story. I didn't quite understand why it ended at the Civil War, except I knew that those lands obviously are part of the states that seceded. And then by the time the federal government kind of gets back on its feet again, shipbuilding has shifted more to iron and soon to steel. They weren't very. They kind of just let it go. I'm like, okay, that's how the story ends. Technology changes, they let it go. Well, now actually, it's part of the continuity that I was looking for, which goes to the end of the 19th century with the development of modern American conservation. Like, where does that come from? And obviously, historians have written, endlessly about the origins of conservation in the 19th century. But there's this thread of it that's, that is kind of part of the General Land Office and in law, that there were attempts to enforce conservation for these particular circumstantial legal constitutional reasons that no one's really explored in great detail. So that I'm like, all right, it'll take me less time to finish this book than to start the whole, to really finish the intelligence project. So let me just finish this book as number 2 and get to the intelligence project as number 3. Now I can talk about the intelligence project, which I'm also super excited about. So I went to grad school, like I told you, I wanted to study oil in the 20th century. I trained as a 20th century historian. I keep getting dragged into the 19th century.
It's a cool century.
It's cool.
I get dragged into it too. I work in the 1980s, and sometimes I find myself in the 1890s, and I'm like, how did I get here?
And it's not a typo, it's not a transposition. There's cool stuff that goes back that far. So, and meanwhile, Matt's like, this is all modern history. What are you talking about? This is all modernity.
Anything after 1300 is modern to me. So like, whatever, it's all the same.
So I wanted to get back to the 20th century, where I'd done my initial training. I wanted to move away from the kind of technology and kind of the earth sciences to social sciences. I want to do something different. I get bored if I do the same thing for too long. I want to just, that's why I'm reading about medieval history. I want to learn about things I don't know anything about. I want to move on. If I teach a class for a couple of semesters, I want to teach a new class on something I don't really know much about, because I just want to learn new things. So that's why I wanted to kind of move to intelligence. But that topic, the reason I got to that was a confluence of a couple of things. Right when I finished my book, this must have been like fall of, I can't remember, 2013 or 2014 now, maybe 2013, whatever it was. It was whatever the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the New Republic magazine, maybe 2013. So New Republic, the 100th anniversary, like they were celebrating it, and a few months later, the entire magazine fell apart, right? They got a new owner, he fired the people at the top, a bunch of other people left in protest. I thought, a lot of people thought it's going to end. There were all these eulogies for it by alumni who've gone, on to other things in journalism. It's doing fine now; it recovered. But the response was, all these kind of liberal journalists were like, "Oh, the New Republic." The response was, "Yeah, they were always terrible on race. They had this big blind spot on race for a long time." And the most obvious example of that was the publication in 1993 of that excerpt from the Bell Curve, the Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray book. So they published an article there, which was a huge controversy at the time. The book itself, but also the publication of the article was a huge controversy. And so I wanted to kind of learn more about that. That was kind of on my mind. But I was also thinking about, like, look, there's a huge amount of work that's been done on early 20th century eugenics. I don't want to repeat that. That's been done. But also there's all this other stuff that happens in the kind of post-war era that I just felt like didn't have much of a literature yet. In terms of, right, there's some work on testing, but I felt there was more that could be done. I wanted to understand, like, what happens later with multiple intelligences and emotional intelligence and mindset theory, which has become, my kids came home from school, like, we're learning mindset theory as like our framework for how our brains grow and develop, and we learn new skills. I'm like, someone's got to write about this because if it's entering schools, it's got some kind of cultural significance that deserves a history. So I'm like, okay, where can I start? And I thought, okay, I'm just curious, who's written about the history of gifted and talented programs in public schools? Pretty ubiquitous across the country, G&T programs. So I looked it up, and it turns out there was very, very little. Like, okay, maybe I will dig into this. And there's some, particularly in kind of ed policy, kind of ed school scholars. I've written a little bit, but there's not much. And so I started digging into it, and was really kind of shocked to discover that the origins were not about testing. In fact, the psychologists who were kind of promoting it back in the 1950s and 60s were saying giftedness isn't about doing well on a test, right? People can test highly and not be what we consider gifted, and vice versa. It was very much about kind of things that couldn't be captured by some kind of psychometric analysis. And so I started digging into it, and then was surprised to discover that some of the earliest states that implemented gifted programs were in the South, which seemed odd, in the kind of late 50s and early 60s, which of course kind of,
that's weird.
What's going on with education in the South in the 50s and 60s? That just seemed really bizarre. So I started doing some archival work. I went to North Carolina.
So you're telling me this has to do with race, but they're not telling you it has to do with race.
Right.
What a shocker.
Yeah. So it turns out to be, it's hard to find I mean, I haven't found enough smoking guns for me to be totally comfortable with this yet, but the timing is obviously suspicious. And I think some of the people who were behind it actually genuinely had liberal views on race that they wanted to push, but when it kind of hits the legislature, they're like,
how do you make this evil?
Yeah. And there these awesome documents about like, the program, the people who run the program at the state level are like, send the money, equally to the segregated schools. And of course, in the local districts are like, we're going to divert this.
We're not doing that.
This is going to reinforce it. So that was, I'm like, this was cool. This is cool stuff. And then on a hope and a prayer, I wrote to the surviving family of Richard Bernstein of the bell curve, who he passed away right before the book came out, which is why Charles Murray is so associated with it. Bernstein was the Harvard psychologist. He was the big figure. Murray was, he'd published already, but he was not what he became kind of notorious afterwards. But he was the only one who was still around to really kind of, be the lightning rod for the book. So I wrote them, and I said, would you permit me to have access to his papers that were at Harvard? And they deliberated and decided to open them up. And so I, went there a couple of times and found some really awesome stuff about the history of that book, of Bernstein himself, and kind of the history of that this story actually played out in the 70s with some earlier work that he'd done that was very controversial. And all this kind of rich stuff that was going to be my second book, and now it's going to be my third book. So I have to do it a little bit longer.
You're like really good at finding things that are like going to piss off conservatives. Like you start with coal, and now then it was like trees and chopping down trees, and now it's like the bell curve. Like you are. It's
not my goal. I mean, the truth is, I'm a really conciliatory kind of person. Like I actually want to kind of bring people together, and I keep finding there are obviously structural forces in our society that are driving people apart. There are incentives for people to be pushed further apart. I just want to write about things that are interesting. That's kind of my driving force here. But yeah, I guess they are.
I think the most interesting things are the most like flammable things. So that's probably it. Yeah. Okay, wait. Last question. This is a question that like Rachel put in. What is your favorite like pop culture movie about like coal magnets? Business people. Like there has to be a movie that you show about this. Like because when I first learned about coal, it was because I read Dickens. Right. And so like in any European history class, you read Dickens, you read Bleak House, something, and you're like, oh yeah, coal was the shit. Yeah. So like, do you assign any novels or like movies in your class when you talk about coal?
So I'll say Upton Sinclair has a book on coal that's pretty terrible. Not good. Not a good book.
Is it terrible as in like it's bad, or terrible as in like it's really gross?
No, it's bad.
Oh, it's bad.
He wasn't a great writer. I'm sorry to say.
The Jungle is not okay. So when you read The Jungle, you're like, this is more gross than interesting.
Yeah, but at least the first 60 pages, maybe 100 pages of The Jungle, it pulls you along. Like the grossness drives the narrative. It kind of gets bogged down, and it's obviously didactic. But like, okay, that's a book I teach. It's a book that's worth reading. he wrote a book that became adapted as There Will Be Blood, called Oil. And I say that it's oil with an exclamation point. Oil was the name of the book from 1927 or something. He had invested in these oil wells in California and like lost all his money, but wrote a book about it. And also, not a great book. This is an example where the movie adaptation is vastly better than the book itself. So I can't recommend those. But There Will Be Blood was a good movie. My honest favorite piece of literature about coal is it's a kind of novella called "Youth: A Narrative" by what's his name? Youth: A Narrative by. He wrote. The main character is the narrator.
Joseph Conrad. Joseph Conrad.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So was he Czech originally? I forget where he came from originally, but he was.
I thought he was Belgian. No, I'm wrong. He's not Belgian.
Whatever he was, he learned English like a third language. So his first story with the narrator, what's his name? I'm blanking on this. I should know this.
The Heart of Darkness book?
Yeah, the same narrator, the same.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Whatever his name.
Yeah.
The first thing he wrote was called Youth: A Narrative, and it's a story about this. It's this little dinky old breaking down boat that was supposed to sail on a kind of merchant mission to Southeast Asia from England to Southeast Asia, and it was carrying coal, right? Carrying coal outbound to be ballast, which was how they did it. They would sell the coal when they got to wherever they were going. I don't know where it's supposed to be. And then they would buy whatever goods they were getting and bring it back. Anyway, everything goes wrong. The whole story is like things keep going wrong. And somewhere in like the middle of the Indian Ocean, the coal spontaneously combusts.
Nice.
And so they're all on the ship, and their cargo is burning, and the fire is getting bigger and big. And there's nothing they can do about it. They can't put it out. It's just getting bigger and bigger. And like they're like, we're gonna sink and we're probably gonna die. But it wasn't immediate. They're like, we have a couple of days, and yet if we don't get help, we're all gonna die. And it's actually a really good story, and that's actually my favorite piece of literature about coal. But it's not about the U.S. at all. It's about Britain.
For the viewers, Joseph Conrad was Polish and English,
cool.
And the narrator is Charles Marlowe. Marlowe narrates Heart of Darkness. Yeah. And Heart of Darkness is one of my favorite things to teach when I teach European history. But I did not realize he also wrote about coal. That is really cool. Also, I like that. There Will Be Blood is like an epic dad movie. Like that's the movie that like, my dad loves. I did not know it was based on an Upton Sinclair novel. So that's great. I'm
like really amazed. I don't know who was the author, like the screenwriter, who thought to take a pretty lousy Upton Sinclair novel that no one had ever heard of and turn that into a pretty good movie. It's I don't know the history of that behind that adaptation, but I'm curious.
Sometimes it's the best, right? Is kind of terrible books become much better movies because they're just not suited to the medium or something like that. So yeah. I think unfortunately we are out of time. I mean, this has been a really wonderful. We have a whole bunch of questions that we just haven't had time to get to.
Email me. If you have more questions, just send me an email. Happy to
email Peter, or just tweet at him or something like that, and he'll make some sort of comment about your appearance, or I don't know, something like that. Probably answer your question. No, he won't do that. I'm just kidding. Anyway, he's very conciliatory on Twitter. He tries to get everybody on Twitter to get along. So anyway, thank you so much, Peter, for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for again spending your Friday evening with us. We do have a big announcement in that Varsha and I are Drinking with Historians is moving to weekly, back to weekly for the summer months. So our next episode is 1 week from now, not the 2 weeks, but 1 week from now. Our guest is going to be Amy Stanley, who's a professor of history at Northwestern. She works on samurai and geisha and all sorts of stuff like that. She's also been involved. There was a controversy about a paper related to comfort women in China and Japan, and she's been involved in the pushback against that. Some really terrible things have happened related to that. So tune in next week and learn more about that. For now, you've seen the links. Go out and buy Peter's book. And thank you again for joining us. And until then, everybody, cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.